Welcome to the Indian Local Author Celebration at the Norwalk Public Library. And the program we're doing right now is Writers as Teachers, Teachers as Writers. And I'm going to turn it over to our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. And thank you so much for having us here. We're really delighted to be able to talk about this subject. There are 4 of us here today, as you can see, and I'm going to introduce each of us, and then we have a round of questions that we will discuss, and then we'll open it up for the audience at the end to ask any questions they might have. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. So Betty Bono, to my right, is the author of historical fiction, time travel novels, The Better Angels and Fear Itself, and 2 short story collections, Neighbors and Other Stories, came out this past summer. The Second Chance Shop and Other Stories will be released, I can talk, in 2023. Before beginning her writing career, Betty taught both science and language arts at the middle school level in the Norwalk Public Schools, and also served as a union steward for the Norwalk Federation of Teachers. Along with Marla Sterling, who is to her right, and other teachers at Nathan Hale Middle School, she introduced and used the Writer's Workshop method for teaching writing and encouraged students to write poetry, memoir, and fiction pieces. Prior to teaching, Betty worked as an attorney in Bridgeport and was co-director of a public interest organization in Washington, D.C. She earned a law degree from Harvard, a master's degree in political science from the University of Michigan, and a bachelor's degree in English education from the University of Illinois. Betty lives in Connecticut with her family. And one thing I want to say is that I am surrounded by amazing people today. These bios are incredible. Mayura Rosenberg, to my left, is the author of the middle grade novel, Indiana Bamboo, which she began while completing her MFA in creative writing at Manhattanville. Prior to its publication, it was the winner of the Tennessee Mountain Writers Excalibur Award, a one-time award for a first-time novelist. A sequel to Indiana Bamboo will, fingers crossed, be out in 2023 or 2024. Mayura has taught writing at Norwalk Community College and at UConn and Stanford for 14 years, and she facilitates a book group at the Weston Library. She is also a lawyer, see what I mean? Who worked with migrant farm workers in Florida, did criminal appeals in New York and Connecticut, and eventually became a tax lawyer working for not-for-profit organizations. This led to her work as a literary executor of the Lorraine Hansberry Properties Trust. Mayura grew up with her parents and 3 cats. She now lives with her husband, we're glad about that, and 1 sweet but demanding dog. Their 3 grown children have flown the coop. Marla Sterling, to my far right, is writing is another passion in her life, following careers as an actor, storyteller, and teacher, with degrees from NYU in education and an MFA from Manhattanville in creative writing. There are 3 of us on the stage today. After teaching acting for adults at Westport Country Playhouse and elsewhere, she taught 6th and 7th grade language arts here in Norwalk for 20-ish years before retiring to write full-time. Lucky her. Her work has been published in Chicken Soup for the Soul, Plum Tree Tavern, Scribes Micro, Connecticut Bard's Poetry Anthology, and elsewhere. She also lives in Connecticut, where contact with the garden, woods, and beach invigorate and inspire her daily. That leaves me. I'm an English professor. I teach at NCC. My poetry's been published in many small literary journals. I have 2 poetry chapbooks, That's the Way the Music Sounds and Talking to the Mirror, and 2 full-length collections, Do You Expect Your Art to Answer and Daughter of Sky. I've also written 2 mystery novels. I'm on the editorial board of Inkwell Magazine and the Norwalk Public Library Board, and I was Norwalk, Connecticut's Poet Laureate from April 2016 to April 2019. So that's a lot of information.
There's a quiz at the end.
That's right.
So I hope you've been taking notes.
Taking notes, that's right. So we're talking about teaching and writing today. So my first question for the panelists is, how did teaching lead to writing, or writing lead to teaching? So do I have a volunteer to start, or am I going to have to pick on you?
I can start.
All right, great.
Because I think this really applies exactly to me. Because when I was in high school, I remember I had a teacher. It was in 11th grade, and I wrote something. The assignment was to write in the personality of a Roman soldier during their wars. And when I handed it back to him, he wrote on it, "Write, my dear, write, you must write." So, of course, being a teenager and he was cute, I thought, you know, there goes my career. Well, 40 years went by, and I hadn't picked up a pen yet. I'd actually picked up the pen, but I kept looking at a blank page and saying, nothing I could write could be as beautiful as this blank page. And then I needed, so I went on to a career with other people's words, which I loved as an actor. And when I decided I needed to change careers and become a teacher, I thought I would have to improve on this record. And I went to Manhattanville, and turns out I already had teaching credentials, so I only needed to get a master's to be able to teach in Connecticut, because otherwise I couldn't get reciprocity for my degree. And so I started in college at this late age by then, and the requirements for the MFA were that you had to write. And imagine that. I all of a sudden discovered that I loved writing. And so I was simultaneously getting to love writing and to have to teach writing, because by now I had my degree again. And the more that I taught writing in the classroom, this project that Betty mentioned earlier called, what was it called?
Writer's Workshop.
Writer's Workshop was a place to have children learn to love writing. That was really its assignment, and it sparked my love of writing. So the two things definitely bounced back and forth. The more that I would show them something that they would enjoy writing, the more I enjoyed it, and vice versa. So I recommend teaching if you want to be a writer.
Nice, that's great. Betty?
Well, Marla was in the classroom next to me at Nathan Hale Middle School here in Norwalk, and we were teaching 6th grade at the time, and we had gone to, I think, a professional development where the idea of a writer's workshop in the classroom was introduced. And the idea was that writing for students shouldn't be just do a 5-paragraph essay on why you think blah, blah, blah. And the students write whatever, turn it in, your assignment is done, and it's over. And the idea of Writer's Workshop was that you would make your students love writing by giving them something they wanted to write about, often themselves, but in a way where they understood that writing was a process and writing was fun, and you weren't going to grade them on it. You'd give them a ton of feedback, but you wouldn't put a grade on it. If a student writes about their grandma who died of pneumonia and how much they love their grandma, you don't put a C- on that. You don't put a B+ on that. You don't put a grade on that. You sit down with them and talk to them and say, tell me more about your grandma. You got me interested. What more could you put in here, because I really want to know about your grandma. So, the concept was, as Marla stated, that you were a writer with your students. And so most of the assignments I gave to my students, I would write myself. And then we could talk as fellow writers. Gee, we were supposed to write about the idea of trouble, getting in trouble. I had a problem with this because I wanted to write about this, but I didn't know enough about that. And you could talk to your students about the writing experience, and they could see you as a writer, and they could share their work, and you could introduce the idea of not just doing writing as an assignment, doing writing as something that showed who you were, and that you could keep working on and making better. And when you felt ready to share it, then you would have a way to share it. So I had always written in all of my different jobs. I had not written fiction since I was a student myself. And I had one class, and they so wanted to write a fiction story about anything, please, Miss Boda, can we write about anything we want to write, you know? Fine, write about anything, write a fiction story. And my story was about an older woman who goes into New York City, and she's at Grand Central Station, and all of a sudden she begins to see soldiers from World War II and what is going on. And then they disappear, and that was sort of the end of the story. No one else has seen them. And summer came, I had fun writing my story, and summer came and I thought, you know, maybe what's happened to this woman is she's going back in time. And I started writing, and that became my first book, the beginning of my series now, The Better Angels, about an older woman and then a group of senior citizens that gain the ability to travel in time. So being a teacher led directly to my career now as a writer. And I recommend it highly for anyone that you know, can deal with middle school or whatever age and loves to write, and passing on the love of writing is a joy in itself.
Great, thank you. Mayra?
So for me, it was really the opposite. I always liked to write. From the minute I could physically write, I wrote a really brilliant story when I was 7 years old. It was called Stinky the Stew. And I showed it to my parents, who were I had very wonderful parents, but they didn't hold back. So my parents read this story, and they said, it's an awful lot like Pepe Le Pew. And I said, no, it's not. My skunk's name is Stinky. And they said, yeah, but you kind of stole the whole story from Pepe Le Pew. So I was kind of, you know, devastated. But you know, that's a different story, and we don't have to have therapy right now. But, so no, but then after, but I always wrote, and I wrote secretly, as many people do. I never told anyone that I was writing, and I majored in economics. I definitely could not have been an English major in college. I would go to English classes, and you know, people always had to talk about the connections between different things, and they would connect one book to another, and I would think, I don't know how to do that. I want to go back to economics, you know. So then, and then I went to law school, but I was still writing, and I acted a little bit, but I was still writing, and not telling anyone. And then the thing that made it even worse about not telling anyone is at one time I was with a bunch of lawyers from the law firm where Betty worked, because my husband also worked there, and they were talking about someone who they all mutually knew who was a writer, and not being especially nice about it. And I had just met these people, and I thought, well, I'm not telling them that I like to write. So it remained a secret. And then I, like so many people who, you know, you have to work. I have 3 children. It's hard to make the time, and you can't find the time to write when you're doing other things. You have to make the time to write. And it was hard to make the time to write. So I ended up going to Manhattanville. I went to a couple of summer workshops, writers' workshops there. And so I was at Manhattanville and writing, and it was great because I started to tell people, well, I'm going to Manhattanville because I love to write, you know, so I was sort of outed now, and that was great. But it was the writing that led to the teaching, because I actually, from the time we moved to Connecticut, I had always wanted to teach at Norwalk Community College, sort of in the back of my mind. It just sort of fit what was important to me in life, and the students who went there, who were so diverse and wonderful and everything else. And so when I had my MFA, there was an opportunity to teach at NCC, and that's how I started teaching. So it was from the writing to the teaching. But my poor students, Laurel gets to teach really cool stuff, and I occasionally teach cool stuff. But I usually teach, and I do love it. I love what I teach, I do. But I teach developmental English, which is for students who need a boost when they get to college, and they're not ready for freshman composition. So they don't get to go do the fun stuff. We have to work on, you know, essays and getting them ready for college writing. So, you know, I try to make it a little bit fun, but it's not as much fun as, you know, reading literature and doing creative writing. But that's how I ended up teaching, was from writing to teaching.
Yeah, my journey is more like yours. You know, when I started to write when I was young, and made the mistake of leaving the thing that I had written on the breakfast table. Like, why did I do that? And my parents took a look at it and they said, you will never write anything like that again. So yeah, it went underground. It went a long way underground. But I always wanted to write. I took creative writing in college, but I was a psychology major. My dad was like, you gotta get a job. This is your sole purpose in being in college, is to get a job. And he wanted me to go into business, and I didn't really want to go into business, but I didn't have a lot of perspective on what was available to me. And so I got my degree in psych and said I was going to go work in, it used to be called personnel. Most of you are old enough to remember that, for it turned into that nightmare we now call human resources. And then I got an internship in Australia doing personnel for Pfizer Chemical Company that, you know, yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
And decided that I really hated doing it. So then what? So then I tell this to young people all the time, right? They're like, I have to know right now what I'm gonna do with the rest of my life. And I say, no, you don't. I didn't know until I was 28. It's okay. And so I went through, I don't know, 5 or 6 different jobs doing various things, and then got married and persuaded my first husband that I should go back to school and get my MFA and teach. So it was the writing first and then the teaching. And honestly, getting an MFA and the teaching was always about eating. I think eating is good, and having a roof over my head is good. So that's really what it was all about. So, since we're on that subject, how does one teach writing? Is it a skill, like any other skill? Or does it demand something more? Is there an intangible that's involved in teaching that? And if there is an intangible, this is too many questions at once, I know, so I will repeat. Is that for all kinds of writing? So, for example, your law writing, right? Or is it only certain kinds? So, I'll let you choose who would like to go first.
Marla, you volunteered last time.
I can start.
Yeah,
okay, great.
I'll start from the side. So I do think that writing can be taught. And it depends what kind of writing it is. Does it mean that every one of us can become the world's greatest novelist? Probably not. But maybe with enough effort, we all have to be optimistic and think maybe yes. But I mean, and there are different types of writing and different things that one is teaching in teaching writing. So right now, I teach kind of a combination to my students of the most basic things you can imagine. What is a noun? What is a verb? I've become acutely aware from the moment I started teaching this of when I'm writing, you know, using comma splices and fragments and starting sentences with conjunctions, which my students are too new to do. You know, you can do all that stuff when you know what you're doing. So there are those basic things, but my students are very bright also, and so they also are learning to think, which is a big part of that type of writing, you know, to analyze and think. And so we're doing a basic level and higher level, and they have to learn to organize and all of that for that kind of writing. With legal writing, it was a lot of analysis. You know, I wrote appeals for a big part of my career, so it's a tremendous amount of writing. And that's a different thing too. And I love to write fiction. And with fiction, you know, you're thinking about different things altogether, as well as all those same things. I mean, you want to have the basics of writing and mechanics and everything else under your belt. But in writing fiction, and you know as readers, you know, you look for things like, do you like the characters? Well, were they well developed? That's, you know, one thing when you're writing. Character development, setting, you know, the voice of the characters is part of what makes you like them or maybe hate them. But a strong voice is an important thing. And then the plot, you know, the arc of the story. Is there tension? Is there emotion? You know, there are so many things that you're looking for when you're writing fiction. So that's a whole nother sort of, you know, other types of things that you have to look for when you're writing. And those things can be taught if someone is paying attention. And I never consciously thought about many of those things. probably until I went to Manhattanville. Those were probably my first writing workshops, and I've been taking some kind of writing workshop ever since. And I think the other thing that's important to teach anyone who wants to actually be a writer or takes their writing seriously in a job is that you have to revise. Revision is, the most important thing. Reading a lot is always great. To be a big reader helps a lot in writing. And those are things people can be taught. Freshmen in college, unless they've gone to a high school that emphasized writing in the English department and they had good English teachers, often don't even know they're supposed to revise things. And you give it back and their feelings are so hurt. I've written stuff all over it. And they're like, but my English teacher in high school always gave me A's. And I'm like, well, they shouldn't have. I don't say that. Thinking that. And it's like, no, well, now it's time to learn to revise your work, and it's the most important thing. So, but a lot of it really, I think I've learned so much over time, and there are different kinds of workshops. So for me, I do, every week I just do a 1-hour generative workshop with a children's writer whose name is Nora Baskin. For years after I finished my MFA, I was in a workshop with the late Patricia Riley Giff, who was a wonderful children's writer and a dear friend, and the most encouraging person. So the value of her workshop for a writer was that she was so encouraging, because it's a very discouraging thing to do at times. And she also gave great feedback, and feedback on your work is so important. And I think with all of that, people keep learning. So I do think people can certainly learn to write both, for jobs and for other things, but creatively as well. But also, often people have to develop their imaginations a little bit too.
Can I piggyback on that to say, I think the thing that you can teach is to think.
Yeah.
Because when a kid is writing, they're just spilling out ideas. So if you can tell them, A, it's a good thing that you think, and these are some things, so whatever you think is good, but these are some things to think about that. And then you can give them the individual tools that'll help them do that. And one of the things you can do, for example, is help them understand what reading it to somebody else or rereading it will do. It shows you what is interesting. If you present it to them as, when you read it to somebody and somebody is interested in it, then you know what you've done good, and then you can ask them, what did you like about it, and give them more of it, or expand. So I think teaching them to think about what they've written, and then teaching them how to go beyond that. Those are the 2 steps that anybody can be taught, no matter what level they're on, although it really works well in 6th and 7th grade. I think some pretty astonishing things come out of that.
Those are such great ages.
I agree with both of you. I do think that you can teach writing, and with the understanding that there's writing for different purposes.
Right.
And I think what Marla said, I think, is a really important component, that having someone understand that when you write, you are trying to communicate something. Instead of, often writing is presented in schools as, this is an assignment and you hand it in. And you talked about revision and the need for revision, and giving them a sense of, you are writing to an audience. It might be an audience of 1, it might be an audience of hundreds, it might be your family, your family reading something that you've written.
Or not.
Yeah, or, like the person you have a crush on in school, you want to write something to them, or you had something amazing happen to you, and giving them a sense that there is a reader, a listener, an audience, and having them see that it's part of a process that they can write to someone else, and that person will tell them, unless you get like a nasty person that says, oh, you did this wrong and you did this wrong. But teaching how to give feedback, I think, is also important in teaching writing. But giving students a sense that someone is listening, and maybe wants to really hear your story, maybe is fascinated by your story, and they might ask you, one of the things we would do is we would have students write something, and then they would pair up and they would read to each other, and the person who was listening had to then say, I liked best these 3 things, and I have questions because I want to hear more about whatever it was. And I remember a girl wrote about a time she was walking through one of the parks in Norwalk, and she got scared by a dog, and then she fell down and broke her leg. She broke her leg. She was running away from this dog, and the dog turned out to, just run off. It wasn't interested in her. But she wrote this piece, and she said, and then it hurt a lot. So I sat in as she read this piece to another student, and it was a pretty good piece. But then the other student says to her, well, what did the dog look like? Because I'm scared of dogs too. And she says, oh, well, I was scared because, the dog was barking and it was really big, and I remember when I was a kid, a dog jumped on me, and then the student said, and when you broke your leg, I've never broken my leg, what did it look like? When you're in middle school, you want all the details. Was the bone sticking out of the skin? Was there blood? How much gore was there? And how did you get help? What did you do? Was there somebody else in the park? And all of a sudden, she wants to write it again and revise it and make it better. And she understands she's telling a story. So I think you can teach that kind of enthusiasm, and you can teach the, what's a noun, what's a verb, what's a preposition, where do you put a comma.
Okay, so for fun, I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Good.
I started taking photography courses during the pandemic because I was like, if I have to look at another word, I'm going to slit my wrist. Because, listen, what happened, right? Everything shut down. All the fun parts of teaching were gone, which were interacting with people in the classroom, and all you did was stare at a screen and grade words, right? So I had to do something that wasn't words. And I found a wonderful teacher through Rowaden Arts Center. He's terrific, and I've taken a ton of classes with him, and I will never be a great photographer. I will be a competent photographer. And if I work at it, it's possible that if I cared enough that I would exhibit. If I did, that's not my thing, right? So, but I think we can teach competence. And I don't know, you guys mentioned imagination, right? How do you teach imagination? How do you teach the thing that takes the writer from competent to amazing, right? Because we've all taught a lot of people, and we've all read a lot of stuff. So there is something that's different, right? You pick up a book and you go, eh. And then there's another book, and it just takes you somewhere that you didn't expect, and what's in it is wonderful, and the language is amazing, and the characters drive you to think in ways that you didn't think before, and there's a philosophical underpinning there, and there's so much intelligence in it. And I'm not convinced that we can necessarily teach that. That has to come from within the person themselves. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Let me tell you what you think.
Can I be a devil's advocate on the other side?
Yes, ma'am.
How dare you tell me that?
You're not to be mean.
I think we have to define what is good writing. And good writing depends on the reader as much as it does on the writer. So if you say, somebody read the beginning of a book to me, and I said, that's perfectly good, clear writing, and it didn't inspire me. But I know 10 of my cousins who would look at that and say, this is really interesting information, and they would not have been interested in the degree of elaboration I personally enjoy in writing. So I think your expectation for what it is you should teach has to vary with the person and the task at hand. My husband recently read Les Miserables, which I had read as a kid, and he, as a young person, and haven't read since. And he kept turning to me and saying, "This was a great novel." It's so excessive, there's so much that should be cut out. And then he read the New York Times article.
Victor, what were you thinking?
Yes, and somebody else said there's excess, so is that work any less good now because the writing is worse? Or did our expectation for what should be in a book change? And therefore, are we not fair in judging writing by saying this is not good because it didn't reach me in where I am right now as a reader?
Well, I think I'll be like the peacemaker.
Good luck. Yeah, good luck.
I think there's two things going on. There's good writing or bad writing, and I don't think it relates so much to topic or even style or whether it personally inspires you. I mean, every fiction reader knows, like, oh, I hate the blood and gore slasher books, but I like a cozy mystery. I don't like this, but I do like that. Those are preferences, and also, even beyond literature, you can be a good writer for a particular job. When you do legal writing, although I think there's a whole element of storytelling in good legal writing. But if you're writing instructions on how to put together a camera, or how to, you've ordered something from Amazon or IKEA, and like the directions are always awful. There's a need for clarity, for sentences that make sense, that communicate, that get the job done. There's that kind of good, competent writing, even if it has nothing to do with inspiration. So I think we're talking about a number of things, at least two. Yes. One of them is what type of work might be interesting or important, and that varies not only on the reader, but the size of the audience. I know some people who are seniors and they are writing for an audience that is their family. They want to pass on, and there could be good and bad writing in that, but good writing in that sense is clarity. Are they telling the story they want to tell? Are they doing it adequately? Will they pass on what they wish to pass on to their family? But there are writers who want to write for the general public, and they want to be on the New York Times bestseller list or whatever, and they want to be read in 100 years and not have somebody say, oh, this is good. So I think there's a number, there's more than one thing going on. Yeah. I think you can teach competent writing to almost everyone. Yeah. Whether you can make them a great writer for every purpose.
I don't think there is a writer for every purpose, but I'm going to give you a moment, but I want to come back to your comment about Hugo, and I think one of the things that I talk about in a class on creativity that I teach is, has it lasted, right? So does that piece of writing, it's not just, as you say, like a personal preference for the moment. I like this is a fun mystery novel, or this is a great piece of science fiction. Is it, in 100 years, are we still going to be reading it because whatever's going on, despite the language, right, or the specifics of it, does that still in some way attach profoundly to what our human experience is? So Shakespeare lasts, right? Hugo has lasted because they have managed to touch on those things. And there may be writers who have been lost. I think this is a lot of what the recovery in terms of women's writing and the writing of people of color that's happening now is that, right? There have been certainly cultural ideas that have kept writers in those areas who do touch on those things from being part of the public discussion. And so we need to rectify that. But for me, the question is, will it last, and can I teach a student to do that? And I don't know that I can.
So I think I can articulate maybe what we agree on, story versus style. I mean, Hugo is a great writer because his story is great and the theme that he's trying to convey is brilliant.
Yeah.
We are now looking at his style and saying, well, part of his style is excessive and could have been, you know, with editors, could have been reduced in size. Could we have taught him to write a better story? Story? No. He was on top of that. Style, we could have worked with him
Could have
on.
been, yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'll go with you on that. Go for it.
So, okay, well, a couple things. First, I just want to say that Betty, when you were talking about those instructions, I think it's time to disrupt the market, and we should just write really funny, good instructions and stories. I think there's money to be made. So there's that, first of all. So we all have to talk later. So, okay. But I think one of the things that we were talking about in the beginning of this discussion was also imagination, and whether imagination can be taught or not. And I certainly have friends who say to me, oh, I have, you know, how do you write a book? I have no imagination. And I think to myself, imagination, I mean, I had an imagination when I was young, but it was also nurtured. And it was nurtured just in the sense that, you know, like probably many of you, and you're here, and you probably did this, or your parents did this with you, one or the other, or both, but they read to me quite a lot. I was an only child, and I longed for stories of my parents' childhoods. You know, I was growing up in the Midwest, they grew up in New York. My dad was a better storyteller than my mom. My poor mother, I used to force her to tell me stories of her childhood. And it wasn't natural to her to do that. But my parents also both wrote, and so they appreciated imagination. And when I stayed up too late at night reading or something, I didn't get in trouble for that. They didn't come in and say, turn out your light. And so that started early, and I know people with better imaginations, but I do have a good imagination, sometimes to my detriment, you know. Alone in the house, I hear a noise, and so,
but that's real.
Yes, and years ago when we called the police, when that happened, they said, don't worry, it could have been real. So, but
That's not helpful.
yeah, I know, it was a little bit scary, actually, when they said that, because we were very apologetic. And, you know, David didn't even blame it on me. So, but I do think that even for adults, I think imagination can be nurtured, and I think, but you have to do it as an exercise, you know, you have to do exercises that bring out imagination, and that's one thing that I think probably all of us have done in writing workshops that we've taken.
You have to give kids, you've got to give people permission to have imagination.
Yes,
Yes, you do. Absolutely.
And people do it in very basic ways. I mean, this book, Indiana Bamboo, started when I was at Manhattanville, and I decided to challenge myself by taking a class that was writing for middle grade and young adult. And the reason it was a challenge is because we had 3 children, and I thought at the time that I could only write things that were short, that were contained, like short stories or picture book manuscripts, essays, and poetry. I'm not a great poet, but those were the things that I thought I could do, and I thought later, maybe I'll be able to like just sustain a whole plot, you know, in a novel. So I took this class, and the idea was to write a novel. And so, not to finish it in the class, but to do a substantial portion. And the first exercise that we did, it was an exercise of imagination, really, but it was first memory. So, and it's a way to develop the imagination. So she said, think of something that happened to you when you were, 8 years old. And so, and you never know when people say things like that to you, what are you going to think of? It's amazing what your brain does when you do those exercises. And the more you do them, the better you get at it. And by the time you do them often, you think of too many things to write, The first time you're sitting in a class and the teacher says that, and it's kind of like, oh man, am I going to think of anything? And so for me, I remembered the time when my friend Joey and I saw a ghost in the attic of our house. And we were positive we saw a ghost. And when my mother questioned us, the mistake she made was questioning us together. And that became, a part of this story. Later it became fictionalized, and it became very fictionalized, But we both described the ghost as, a little person, a little man wearing a stovepipe hat, and that we were sure that we saw him. We lived in, it wasn't tumbling down, but my parents were renting this mansion, which was very fun and very scary at the same time. And we lived there for 2 years when we first moved to Indiana from Ohio. And it had, there were 3 floors, and then the 3rd floor had a stairway that went up to the roof, which was very exciting and very terrifying, right? Both, because I always thought, and I'm an only child, so my parents were, on the same floor where we slept, but I had my own room. I never got to share a room. Unlike those of you who had to share a room, I desperately wanted to share a room. I was always scared. So, so with this stairway, going up to the roof, I mean, as cool as that was, someone could come in. I mean, it was locked, but, adults, they know how to get in where there are locks. So we were short, but we reinforced each other. And when we were describing, and so that's when my mother taught us the meaning of the word hallucination. To which, and this did make it to the book though, but it got fictionalized. So, and so we of course insisted it wasn't a hallucination. And how could we have had the same hallucination? It was the same because we were describing it in front of each other. But from that, it became fiction. And so when you do exercises like that, again and again and again, I think for most adults, I don't think for all adults, I don't know, I haven't met all adults, but but I think that to different degrees, people can develop their imaginations and start to take, even from real things, make them into fictionalized things and add to them and think things. And I think most people have better imaginations than they think, because how many people have been scared alone in a house because you've heard a noise? I mean, I don't know. They're just
and talking about teaching, I mean,
Yeah.
people that teach very young children, that's the kind of exercise they might do. Having them stand up at circle time and talk about their family, or talk about an animal they would like to see, or talk about what they see in the fall out the window, or if they're building something with blocks, well, what is that? And then if they have that kind of instruction, that's part of teaching what will become communicating and will become writing eventually, hopefully.
One thing that you just said, that we talked about little children. I remember when our kids were little, or little meaning like kindergarten. I guess I couldn't write yet in kindergarten, well, 2 of the 3. But but later when they were writing in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, they were still allowed to write creative stories. And then the school system makes them start writing 5-paragraph essays, which is I do the same thing because my job isn't to teach creative writing, but I feel badly about it, and I would like them to be able to do more creative writing. And I remember as a parent, and maybe because I'm a writer and like to write, I was heartbroken because my children wrote incredible stories. I don't mean better than anyone else's children, by the way. They were wonderful, and because they were my children, I loved their stories so much, and to this day I will tell you they were very good, but I bet everyone else, either as a child, if you don't have children, or if you do have children, your children wrote wonderful stories or told wonderful stories when they were little, or you did, before you got imagination squished out of you, because everybody forces you to write 5-paragraph essays, which people do have to learn to write, because who knows what job they'll have. But there should also be a lot of room to continue creative writing, I think, like all the way through. And that would help with imagination.
And if you learn storytelling ability, it helps you whatever. I mean, when I was writing legal briefs, and I worked with an older attorney when I was writing one of the first ones, and there are 2 sections. There are the facts, what they call the facts, which is the story of what happened and why it ended up in a legal case, and then the law, where you say why those facts fit with and why your client should win. But the attorney said to me, tell it as a story you want the audience, and it's usually the judge, to read this and be in that story and then understand, and then you apply, and then it's perfectly clear that your client should win based on your insight on the law, but tell it as a story. And I thought that was so interesting because I didn't think of it that way, but I was fortunate to work with him right off the bat, and then after that I understood that you tell the story, and you can do that in all sorts of contexts, even if you're not writing fiction. Tell the story.
Yeah. My perception is that education is shifting in such a way that it is serving business rather than imagination.
Yes.
And as a result, children are suffering from that. So I'm getting nods, so I must be doing it right. Yeah. So you have brought up reading. I'm going off script here for a minute, you guys. I'm interested in what role you think reading plays in writing, and how you respond to today's students, who I have come through my creative writing classes all the time, who say they don't like to read but they want to write. What would you say?
How do you start? Why don't you start? Because that's like really interesting. And you just refer to your students who say that.
Yeah, well, I tell them they can't be a great writer if they don't read, but they don't really want to hear that. They think that they're independent and they think they can do it without reading, and I don't think they quite understand the relationship. So we spend a lot of time like looking at words and trying to think about what other writers have done and how those models can help them as writers. And it teaches pacing and characterization and language use and environment and all those other things, right, that you have to put into a good story. Look at what they've done, and it also teaches literary theft, which is a good thing. Because you need that. We all steal from other
What was
writers.
your character stick?
Yes, stinky list too.
There you go. Got to start somewhere. So yes, I think reading is profoundly important. And while I'm on my soapbox, I also think that it's really important that as teachers and as writers in general, that we buy books, right? Because writers live by other people's purchases, and their publishers aren't going to publish them again if those books don't get bought. And so I think those things are both really important, and there's such a download culture, right? Oh, I can just get it for free online. It's with music, right? I know you've run into that, and it's with films and everything else, and you just think, oh, well, you can just go get it. But somebody made that, and that was hours of work and time and imagination and study, right? And skill, and that has a value. And so I think that, learning to treat the work product by reading it, by understanding what goes into that, is a really important part of that teaching.
Kids have so much access to story without reading.
Yes.
Movies have been around for a long time, TV, but it's bombarding us now.
Even
with
music videos.
stories. Right. So you're right, kids want to produce an event that inspires people. And in the past, the method for doing that, the easiest,
Right.
and one that might actually pay for your life, was writing books, and that's no longer true.
Right.
So when they say they don't read, that doesn't mean they're not imbibing story.
True.
But part of the problem is that the format of, let's say, movies. So I was in the theater. So one of the things that's really interesting about teaching writing is that the skill for writing a film script or a play is almost the exact opposite of a novel, okay? The thing that they have in common is that they both have to have good story, all right? The thing that's different, particularly for plays and movies, is that if you write everything, if you describe everything, my God, pictures and speech, right? So if you're writing for that milieu, you have to think about, and this is why I said writing is thinking.
Yeah.
You have to think about what about that story can be translated into video. What can the two actors staring deep into each other's eyes? You don't need to say, I love you, if, you know, right. So I'm glad that you point out that they have to read books in order to continue creating that understanding. On the other hand, playing with those arts that don't use words, there's a woman named Viola Spolin who wrote the most famous book called on improvisation and acting, which I taught. And some of the experiences would be things like, there would be a screen on stage and the actor would be behind the screen, so the audience couldn't see it. And you would have to walk across the stage, and from the way the audience saw you walk across the stage, they had to figure out where you were coming from and going to. You had to put into an image your fear or your terror or your hurry, and the more you did it, the more you realized, oh, there's more that I can show by, you know, stopping here, going like this, you know, if you stop at the door, you go like this. Hands down, where are they going? A date, you know, something important. So you can learn from those other methods.
Yes.
And apply it to a book. If in a book it has to be put into words. But I wouldn't despair of your students, because at least they want to create more stories.
Oh, yes, yes. I've got them in the classroom.
Again, here I am, I'm agreeing with both of you.
We're not
We're
fighting.
not disagreeing.
Yeah.
Well, good, then I'm fine. I do find, and I did find even back when I was teaching, and I haven't taught for 7 years now, but even when I was teaching, I found students who were not familiar with books, didn't love books, hadn't read books, didn't particularly want to read books. And there is that, even if they're interested in stories, and part of it is just showing them the connections and making a lot of books available to them, and all kinds of books. And I remember once a group brought around by one of the principals I worked for was coming through my classroom, and we had a nice school library back then, which they sort of cut out of the building, but I had, in addition, I had more than 1,500 books in my room that I had bought at used book sales or whatever, thanks to the library that, you know, runs used book sales and passes out books, and I had all of these books, and at the time I taught 8th grade, I had 1,500 books, so if a kid would say, oh, I don't want a book, I'd say, well, you go find one in the back of the room. They're right there, but you borrow it from me. And I had books on how to draw airplanes, you know, how to draw dragons. I had the I Spy books, which are intended for like 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds, so they have big photographs and there are rhymes. I had Nancy Drew books. I had comic books. I had a lot of graphic novels. And any kind of book helps. If that book gets a kid reading. And I had, and the little group that was touring around, the principal asked me afterwards, well, you have 8th graders here, you know, some of them are 13 years old. Why did you have comic books and I Spy books and how to draw airplanes or how to draw dragons. And I would say, because if you have a reluctant reader, but they like to draw, they're gonna pick up how to draw dragons, and they're going to start reading the directions, and they're drawing, and maybe they're writing at the same time, and they have to read, and getting them hooked on any book, I think, helps, and exposing them to all different kinds of books. And at the time in school, I don't even know if they do it anymore, but like, in addition to teaching writing, we went through novels. We had 6, 8 novels that we would go through with our students, exposing them to very, very different kinds of stories and different kinds of writing. And I don't think kids have that access. That's why books are so important. Instead of giving a kid an anthology and they read a little piece of something, it's not the same.
Let's see, and read the importance of reading. Well, I think about this a lot because I read a lot for pleasure, and I also am in a book group, and I'm a facilitator of a book group, so 2 books a month for my 2 book groups, and then just books, and I'm also addicted to books on, they're not called books on tape anymore, you know. So I'm addicted to Audible books in the car, and to the exclusion of some very good podcasts. I don't listen to podcasts, and I should, you know, I'd be a little more, it would just be good. But I listen to Audible books constantly, so I'm always listening or reading, but I think about it as a writer, because much of the time I'm reading just for pleasure or because it's for one of the book groups, and sometimes that's more pleasure or less depending on how much I like the book. And I'll think, you know, I wonder if this is influencing me as a writer. But other times, because I think a lot of it is very subconscious. You know, you read a lot, and just by osmosis, you're just getting so much from reading. You're getting, you know, ideas of story and style and setting and all of it. But the one thing that I do often notice is emotion. And just because I think I'm always trying to remind myself, right, I think also right at this moment, I'm writing a book for adults that I started not a long time ago, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And then I didn't want to write because it's not happy. And my books for middle graders are pretty, you know, they have serious elements, but they're also funny. And they were as much an escape to write as anything else. This book is not an escape, and it has difficult things that sometimes I'm very depressed after I've been working on it, which is why I've put it off. And I think that's why I will a lot of times when I'm reading really be taken with emotion, because in this book, emotion is a very important part that I have to always remember to have in there. So sometimes as a writer, when I'm reading, just, you know, for me, I will really focus, think, gee, that writer did that really well. I want to do that too. And other times it's just subconscious. And I think that's what's so great about, you know, all the things for students, just getting them to read. But I do want to say, Laurel, about the thing that you said earlier about, you know, it just feels over the years, it has felt more and more as if, you know, students who come to college, of course people want to get a job. I mean, that's really important. People have to work, we have to eat, we have to have a roof over our heads. But the value of just learning it's become really devalued. You know, the whole liberal arts idea and thinking and learning about things that have nothing to do with you, it makes me very sad. And I think that we can do both. I mean, why shouldn't students be coming to college to learn about, you know, the world and to become thinkers and, you know, and liberal arts and all different things, and also go become whatever it is that they're going to become. And it's hard, and part of that also leads to, I think, students not reading as much for pleasure. I think a lot of it's not just all the video stuff and the this and that. I think it's a whole lot of things that, you know, sort of combine to make less reading just, I don't know. So I find that, you know, through the years at NCC, I always ask my students if they read for fun. And in the past, I would get 2 or 3 hands up, you know, people, and that would warm my heart, at least someone's reading for fun. But this year, when I asked, nobody's reading for fun.
Oh.
And maybe, and you know, I just want to say that doesn't really mean, I mean, it's one class, you know, it's not a good sample. But they also, just as an aside, they also know very little, this class, about civics and